Hello, everyone. I am so excited to be back because of the guest that I have with me today. Let me tell you a little bit about Professor Christopher Oliver before we get started. Chris joined the Tulane faculty in 2014 as a professor of practice jointly between the Department of Sociology and Environmental Studies programs. He holds the endowed position of Jill H. and Abram A. Glazer Professor of Social Entrepreneurship and uses the funds to develop innovative approaches to examining issues of social and environmental justice by drawing upon design thinking and various forms of visual and spatial techniques of analysis, including mapping, geographic information systems, and photographic and video approaches to qualitative and quantitative analysis. Wow, that's really impressive. And I hope in the next 30 or 45 minutes, you'll explain what this means to us mere mortals out here.
Okay, I will try. Yeah, absolutely.
But this is very impressive. And I'm really looking forward to hearing about some of the amazing work that you've been doing with citizens on the ground. Welcome to my show, Chris.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
You're very, very welcome. So why don't we start by telling our listeners about one of your favorite stories where you worked with citizens groups, fighting a big guy or a group of big guys. It's usually not just one, and where you feel that you achieved a good measure of success.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'll try to be brief as I can, and I'm not always as brief as I probably could be. This is the problem of being a professor, right? And having control over the classroom. But I've worked in a variety of capacities, working with different communities. Some have been, I think, successful even for maybe shorter periods. Some I think have provided like a success that brings more attention to the issue, right? Which is important. I would like to say that in many cases we've had like major successes, but quite honestly, this is one of the challenges, like with a lot of, especially with environmental justice communities, is they often don't really get exactly what they actually want or need, right? I mean, it's an ongoing battle, and I'll to briefly describe what happens is so when I got to Tulane, I started working in environmental justice as part of a summer program, and that's where I actually initially was working with the environmental law clinic at Tulane, and then eventually branched out to work with Louisiana Environmental Action Network, which is a community partner environmental justice NGO that I've been working with now for 7 years. And they've got 40 years of experience in working in Louisiana, primarily between Baton Rouge and here, but really throughout Louisiana in terms of these communities. And so the one thing, in terms of the work I do is trying to bring student engagement in particular, as well as the resources we have at the university to support these communities in some way, but not do it in such a way that we're telling them anything that they don't already know, right? They're coming to us and telling us, these are the things that we can do to work with them, to be supportive and to provide, like capacity, resources, right? Anything that will work in terms of community empowerment. And certainly much of that comes from my own background in working in these issues, but also in working with LEAN, and I'll refer to Louisiana Environmental Action Network as LEAN because that's who they go by, because of their relationships with these communities. And so everything that I've been doing for the most part has been going through LEAN itself, with the exception of one of the bigger kind of campaigns that we took on that's still ongoing again, and I'll tell you more about that when we get to the end of the story here. My part of the story is Gorden Plaza, which is a residential neighborhood in the Desire area that was built as part of a federally funded program through the city to do a couple of things: provide public housing for low income and lower middle income, and then also provide for resources so that middle income residents could purchase homes, right? And especially households of color, individuals of color, those that have been denied because of redlining and other kinds of urban policy issues that didn't give them an opportunity. And this was part of, in our research, part of kind of the war on poverty and a whole bunch of programs coming out of like Johnson and Nixon into the 1970s to create federal funds to do these kinds of things. And they were moving away from kind of the large scale public housing with the idea of trying to really get residents integrated into actually buying their homes so that they would have home ownership so they could build equity, right, for generational wealth. And so this was a big part of what the Gorden Plaza development was. It was surrounded by a number of other developments that were just kind of the traditional kind of public housing in which you had residents who were renting basically from the city. But even within the townhomes, there were some that were purchasing, but these were detached single family homes. And there's roughly 60 of them. I think initially there were planned to be 200 within this area. And the whole area had something like 2,000 or more residential households in this area, again, with the townhomes. There's an apartment complex, and then there was these detached homes. So Gorden Plaza was developed in the 1970s, and the residents began moving in the early 80s. And what they had done is they had decided to use publicly owned lands, owned by the city, that happened to be built on top of the agricultural street landfill, which was a primary disposal site for the city from about 1909 until about 1959. And the idea was, and this is not unusual. And I mean, one interesting thing in doing this, the one thing about being an environmental sociologist who does environmental justice work is I'm never really that surprised, even though I find myself still surprised at times by some of the things I hear. And one of it was that, this was pretty commonly practiced in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And even today, there's still states, in fact, because land has become so scarce and expensive, there are states who are still developing former landfills into residential school zone, school buildings, et cetera. And there's a great deal of faith in the engineering and the ability to basically, develop this land and provide for permeable barriers and other kinds of things, to correct drainage and all that, to ensure that these landfills don't pollute the households, right, or those neighborhoods. And that isn't the case oftentimes, and certainly not, with the technology they were using back in the 70s. And so they basically graded it, and put backfill over top of the landfill, and then built homes, built these townhomes, apartment complexes, and detached residential homes. And the most shocking thing about, and I'm kind of talking backwards here, but what I got involved with the residents at Gorden Plaza in two ways, really. Well, really one way, but one way that was interesting is one of my students came to me and asked if I would work with him on a summer thesis, looking at what's going on with the Gorden Plaza residents. And I was absolutely surprised, because I took a class in environmental justice back in 2001 at Michigan State University, where I was doing my PhD. And one of the articles that we read, one book that we read, was a Tulane professor who was writing about Ag Street and what was happening in Gorden Plaza from the 90s. And so, I hadn't put two and two together. I moved to New Orleans. I was interested in doing stuff. And all of a sudden I heard the name, Gorden Plaza and Ag Street. And I was like, whoa, I can't believe this is happening. This is almost 20 years later, right? And so it turned out, it was really 35 years later from when they first moved on to the site, and about 30 years after they had discovered there were issues. And
so, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was a panacea 35 years ago. Is that what you're saying? They were supposed to be this amazing, wonderful, right? When you heard about it.
That was the expectation, was that this was an opportunity. And in talking with the residents, that, it's really interesting, because there was a lot of low-income homes or households that were living in that area, but all of them were definitely middle income. They all had steady jobs. They all qualified for these loans. They were given, FHA loan, first-time homeowner loan, so they reduced the overall cost, but they could qualify for these loans to purchase a house. So, it wasn't a low-income neighborhood. It was a middle-income working neighborhood, right, of primarily African Americans or Blacks. And so, yeah, it was
a great thing. That's what I meant.
Right.
It was a great
thing.
It's a great idea, and a great. So it was like I said, a panacea at that time.
Absolutely. And so long story short, and I'll kind of step back after I say this, is we worked with them to develop a exhibition at the Newcomb Art Museum on campus, in which we were going to provide a great deal of details and artistic representations of photography and video, and audio and video recordings of the residents, of their experiences. And it was actually, we named it the American Dream Denied. And that was the residents' idea, because this came up in a number of conversations when we were doing these video and audio interviews with them, is that this was, the expectation was they were beginning to, they had the ability to tap into the American dream now, right? This whole idea of equity and home ownership and generational wealth. This was an opportunity to do this. And again, there were a lot of other places throughout the US where this was happening, right? This was a big push through the housing administration during this time, right? And so, yeah, they were very much excited about it. You know, a lot of them said they spent, you know, all of their savings to do this. They invested everything into these properties. You know, they started families, they brought families in, or started families. And within just a few years, what happens is they built a school. As part of the promise of building this is that they would put in a new school, a high school and an elementary school. An elementary school, the high school was already there, and they were updating it, and then they wanted to build an elementary school right in the actual neighborhood, right on top of Agriculture Street landfill. And within just a few years, they began to see manifestations of lead poisoning in particular. And lead poisoning usually is one of the, when you have a lot of heavy metals and other kinds of dioxins and stuff, short of kind of the longer term illnesses you may see, like respiratory issues and cancers, lead poisoning is something usually that shows up more quickly, because it's, you know, at higher effects, you begin to see things like decaying teeth, hair loss, you know, like just the manifestations of other kinds of physiological manifestations. So it's usually one of those metrics when you have a heavily polluted site that you'll see. And that was beginning to show up for sure. And the EPA came in after much push by the residents and the city to try to deal with what was going on, and eventually decided that the site had pollution issues, but it was somewhat minor. And so they decided, and they were actually looking to be listed as part of the new Superfund site, right? This is the NPL as part of CERCLA. And so they wound up not making it. They didn't make the list based on the criteria that the EPA uses to determine that. The residents were really, really upset. Go ahead.
You see this so often, where the whoever they are that come in to do a study, they say, well, yeah, there's a little bit of lead, but it's not enough to be harmful. Or there's a little bit of mercury, or a little bit of fluorochemicals or forever chemicals, but not enough to be harmful. You see that over and over and over again.
Yeah. And, you know, there are questions for sure from some of the scientists I work with who work with these communities about even the process, how that they test, you know, and this, if strategically avoiding certain ways to find pollution or not find pollution. And certainly that's part of it. You know, I'll leave it to them to say that, but I definitely think that there was something going on. The political nature of what was happening was really important. And mm-hmm. I began to look at the history of it. So long story short, it took them another 6 years before they finally were able to get the site listed as part of the Superfund in 1994. I think it's no accident. There's no, you know, I don't have any written materials or anybody who said this yet, but it happened to be the same year that Clinton signed the executive order to implement environmental justice elements into all of the EPA decision making, and actually within the broader context of urban and housing, so that you had to consider issues of racial equity around environmental justice issues as part of any federally funded program. And so that same year happens to be the year where this particular site was eventually listed as part of the Superfund. And I know that the EPA was going back and revisiting a lot of sites to see if there were kind of EJ issues. And so maybe that's how it fell into a pool of places. And so the EPA came in and did some remediation, but quite honestly, it was pretty spotty. There was a lot of questions about how they did the remediation. They were also, some of the residents wouldn't allow the EPA to come on and do work on those sites. So there's a whole lot of questions about the effectiveness and the kind of coverage of what they did in terms of the approaches they took. There's also some issues around how they did it and they were trying to use permeable barriers that are actually used within the soil, basically to try to basically allows water to go through, but it also keeps the chemicals from rising up. And
so the student who invited you told you about this, the Gorden Plaza, what was your involvement at that point with the student?
Yeah, I mean, he was in my class and was doing a summer project that was funded through Tulane. And so I said, sure, I would love to work with you. And we did some stuff by doing some reconnaissance out there and did some photography, but almost parallel to that. I mean, within like a few weeks of this, my former partner who works in housing was at a meeting and was at a presentation and met a woman who was talking about Gorden Plaza. And it turned out to be Shannon Rainey, who's the president of the residents of Gorden Plaza. And so they talked, and Shannon said, look, have your husband call me. And so I called Shannon up and I was like, I have a student who's working on this. I can't believe this is still happening. This is unbelievable. She said, yeah, we know it for sure. Do you want to come to a meeting? And I said, sure. And so I started going to meetings. I think we were meeting probably once a month, sometimes more, depending on what's going on. And this started in like 2015. And just the history of it, there was a lawsuit back in the 90s that came out of the original EPA involvement, and the people's just upset with like both what the EPA did and also the lack of city response, the issue with the school. And so there was a lawsuit under that particular community organization, which is a whole long story that we really don't have probably that much time to talk about today. But I will say that it did not resolve the issues. It did not involve the city or the federal government having to clean up the site. And there's a bunch of discussion with residents today about who actually receives settlements. And it's a really important point of contention within the community. Beyond that, though, then they reformed a new group. And part of it was older residents who have been there for a while, and some of the newer residents who had moved onto the site in the 2000s. And so Shannon moved there in the early 2000s and didn't quite fully understand what was happening. And this is often the case with sites like this is it's a combination of things. Like residents don't want people to know sometimes because they don't want it to affect their property values, right? And then obviously if you're selling your property, you're not actually by law forced to disclose these things unless you know that your actual property is contaminated itself. There may be contamination around you, but you don't have to disclose that. And there's very limited things you actually legally have to disclose.
Actually,
right?
I'm very, very familiar with what you're talking about. And this is going on all over the country, where people are worried about their property values. Yeah. And you would think they would worry about getting sick and dying, but that's something that if you're not sick today, they figure you're probably not going to be sick tomorrow. And there's sort of a fact of life that, but that's very real. That's very, very real what you're talking about. And
absolutely.
And it's a barrier to the people trying to take the torch and do something because their kids are getting sick or their neighbors are getting sick or their auntie is getting sick. But go on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And one of the residents in particular, when we were interviewing him, he said, people ask me like, why don't I just leave? And, why don't we just move? And he's like, this is my life. I've invested everything I have in this property. Now, because it is a Superfund site and we know it's contaminated, my property value is pretty low, almost zero effectively, depending on whether I can sell or not sell it. And so, it's not, it's one thing to say you can just move away when you have the resources and wealth to do that. It's another thing when you have everything invested in it. But also then that really is telling to this kind of situation where people have to decide between their health and the wealth that's generated from a home, right? And this is important, but like it really gets to the heart of like, people who are in the middle income bracket, lower middle income, like, it doesn't take much of loss in terms of wealth or equity to wind up moving into the lower income bracket and having a situation where you're just getting by or barely getting by. And so it's terrible that we have to make those decisions, right? It's terrible that anybody has to be in a community where they make those kinds of decisions, right? Between you being sick, between your partner being sick, between your children being sick, right? And you having equity that's been built into a home, right? And so, yeah, that came up time and time again for sure. And that was a big part of what we were trying to do with the museum exhibition. So long story short, I began attending a lot of meetings and I was trying to help in whatever way I could, but I also was just trying to listen and learn from what was going on. And it was at a period in which they were kind of beginning to regroup and rebuild and try to figure out ways to kind of reinvigorate media interest and public interest, and the city in particular, to re-engage with what's happening to them. And they had gone through some setbacks with the previous mayor, Mayor Landreau. And especially when the new mayor was being elected, right, there was some discussion about it, and they were bringing it to her attention, right, in terms of Mayor Cantrell, that like this was an issue. And so at some point, Mayor Cantrell had actually responded as a candidate, and had responded actually as a city council person, that this is something that needs to be dealt with. And so that was part of like what was going on during that. And so we basically, at some point, I met with the museum director, and they said that they had an opening because somebody had pulled out, and they were wondering if I was interested in taking my new lab, which was actually brand new at the time, which is the Critical Visualization and Media Lab, which is a lab that kind of does a variety of different things in terms of trying to work with communities and provide both resources, technical support, and just labor, right, for my students to work with them, work with the community and help them in whatever way we can. Using media as kind of the touchstone, but we do stuff with science data as well. We do mapping again as part of it. And so this museum exhibition was kind of a perfect opportunity for us to kind of test the waters with the students I was working with, as well as we ended up bringing like in another, I think at some point we had about 18 or 19 students who were working on this project. And we were working in concert and collaboration with the residents of Gorden Plaza, the community group, and the People's Assembly, which is a local kind of social justice oriented group. And the three groups were working together to kind of create this exhibition. And we only had a couple months to do it. So it's actually, I have to admit, my students did an amazing job. And of course, the residents put in all kinds of time, and that was amazing. And People's Assembly was amazing as well. And they did a whole bunch of amazing stuff. We commissioned some artists to do some artistic representations as well as part of this. But it was great because again, it highlighted these issues. We had an opening, and I think there was probably like 600 people who came to the opening, which was great. One of the most interesting things is we were transitioning from a previous exhibition on mass incarceration and women, and into this new exhibition. And the mayor happened to show up for a private viewing of that exhibition before they actually took it down, the persistory exhibit. And it happened to be the exact same time that the residents of Gorden Plaza showed up for a meeting for us to be working on this exhibition. And they ran into the mayor, and the mayor saw them. And Shannon definitely knows the mayor knows Shannon. And so, she immediately began to understand that like, this is something that they're trying to push into the media spotlight to make it, to hopefully put some pressure on the city and maybe the DEQ and EPA as well to like do something.
I'd like to jump in, and our listeners really need to be paying attention to this. When the mayor showed up at this event, that gave it gave the residents and the citizens, it was empowering to them to see their mayor there. But to get the mayor's attention, that is very, very important. Not critical to every project, but very, very important. And if you're trying to fight the big guys in your community, if you can get your government, your mayor interested and involved, that's a really, really big feather in your cap toward getting your message out. And I am a little bit embarrassed, but I wasn't really familiar with Gorden Plaza. And when you first brought it up to me, I admit I wasn't familiar with it, and I am now. But I'd like to do something about my embarrassment and offer my help going forward. One of the things I have gotten very good at with my work, shining the light on the Army Corps of Engineers, is I can bring attention to a cause. That's one of the things I can do, and I'd like to offer my services to you and the residents of Gorden Plaza to get their message out, because the more people that know about what's going on, the better it's going to be for them.
Absolutely, yeah. And I would say like, I can put you in touch with Shannon Rainey, and hopefully Shannon can come, or one of the other of the main residents, or maybe even a collection. We've done some other media podcasts and radio interviews in which we've had 3 or 4 residents there. I think it would be great if to have Shannon on and have her tell, because I'm telling the experience by virtue of what they've told me, which is I think I've learned a great deal, but like having them talk about those experiences and what happened is so important. And definitely, I know they could continue, and again, the thing is, that was 6 years ago, right? When I first started doing this, and it's 6 years later. And what they have simply asked for this whole entire time, like the early lawsuit was looking for a variety of things. And this particular iteration and this community organization is really, they just want the city and or the federal government to reimburse them for the equity they have in their homes and give them some money to move. Like, they're not looking for, huge amounts of damages, right?
And punitive damages,
right,
things like that. That'll make any organization or any government run away screaming. They just want what's due. That's
yeah.
it.
And at some level, I mean, I fully understand that they want to get off there. They want to get, out of that area. There, all the other places have closed. Post-Katrina, they shut down all the other housing in the area. Frighteningly enough, though, they have built a new apartment building that's on one of the former sites. So actually, there's new development going on in this exact site. And there's been new residents moving in. And so, it's still an ongoing issue in which, that's happening. But also, there have been many deaths. I've met people who've lost their partners, who've had multiple cancers and respiratory issues and miscarriages happening time and time again for people who either grew up on those sites while they were living on those sites, but even those who grew up on the sites and left and still wind up having miscarriages, from the exposure issues. And Shannon can tell you more about it, but we're talking about couple dozen people who've died out of 55, 60 households. We're talking about 30 deaths attributed to cancers and or illnesses that are likely from exposure. And so that whole public health thing is always a difficult thing, and it's always this issue of how do you link exposure issues to particular health outcomes and say definitively, like, this cancer was caused by this or this respiratory thing was caused by that. Well, recently, and after many years of pushing, Louisiana now is actually is charting cancers, right? The tumor registry is something that was put in place about 15 years ago. And finally, they've got like a full decade of data. And it turned out that the zip code the census tract where they live is the second highest rate of cancer in the state of Louisiana. Given
horrible, but it's better to know.
And have some proof about it, right? To say, like, this is showing that we're not just, it's not us, it's not lifestyle issues, it's not a lot of the things you hear, from health experts or others, politicians in particular, like that clearly there's some link between the exposure issues and what happened to the people.
About a week ago, I watched Radium Girls, and it's a movie about these young girls, only girls. I don't know why. I guess they thought men's hands were too big. They don't know how to paint, but they used to use radioactive dye to paint dials for soldiers in the war. And in this, and of course, these girls were getting sick, and the doctors, the company doctor, was telling the girls things like, well, it's because you don't know what good hygiene is. And he gave her a book on good hygiene, or told another girl she had syphilis. And she said, but I'm a virgin. So that movie just makes me so mad. And then, but at least I say to myself, well, that was during World War II. That was 50, 60 years ago. But then I hear that it's still going on now.
Yeah,
it's still going on now. It just makes my blood boil. But like I said, it's better to know, better to have that data.
Right. And this issue of, like you pointed out, that these young women who are dealing with this issue, and then it kind of moved into the big thing in the 1970s was the hysterical housewife, right? That this is about women just overreacting to a situation and not really seeing it for what it is, or not understanding the science, or and it's like that just isn't true. They understand what's happening better than anyone, right? And women in particular, because of reproductive issues and the children, and they see these things. And so, it's terrible, the things that you can often hear and still hear from corporate America, but even from politicians as well, right? That wind up, saying things like that about people, that are experiencing these having children die of cancer, having their, again, partners die and parents die and having reproductive issues. And then to turn around and say something like, oh, they're just being hysterical, or, oh, they're just overreacting to a situation. They don't know that's going on, and that just happens. And it's really.
Thank you so much for the work that you're doing and Tulane University and your work, and you're working with LEAN, Louisiana Environmental Action Committee. And thank you so much, because, working together, no one person can get anything done. One person can start something, but no one person can get it all done. And so thank you for your work and the work that you're doing with not only these with LEAN, but also with the residents. Is there any word of encouragement you have that you can share for our listeners today who are trying to deal with the big guys in their own communities?
Yeah, I think you said it. I think it's a concerted effort. It's going to take a lot of different people. I do think that, we are beginning to really grapple with these issues of racial inequities in this country in ways that we've been doing for a long time, but really have come to the forefront of the media in the last year and a half or 2 years. And I think that's hugely important, because there are environmental justice issues everywhere, and there are injustices in every community. It isn't always about issues of race, but it's disproportionately impacting these communities based on race, right, as well as class and ethnicity. And so this is happening coast to coast. We live in Louisiana, and Louisiana does have both a history and a reality of geography that, Cancer Alley is this thing, and like the industrial corridor, there's no doubt about the oil and gas production and chemical production that is in some ways unique. But you can go to every single state in the United States, and you can go to every single country throughout the world, and there are injustices. And so, yeah, it needs to be a concerted effort, and we work with the environmental law clinic, and they do incredible work, general, environmental lawyers. That's an important part of it. Obviously the policy side of it, you need the health, right? You need the environmental scientists, you need the public health people, you need the doctors who are part of the equation as well. But you need the community activists and advocates too. And places like People's Assembly here in New Orleans is advocating, right, for people in so many different ways, and like tirelessly. I mean, I'm amazed at the work that they do. So yeah, it has to be kind of that cooperative thing. And of course, then the community members themselves, they're so important to what's going on. Of course, they get wore down because they're dealing with it on both sides. They're dealing with fighting the injustice and dealing with the consequences of the injustice. And so that's, just providing some kind of support that allows them to keep going in some way is really important. But,
So I guess what you're trying to say is if you're out there and you're working with the big guys in your communities, you can't do it alone, and you shouldn't do it alone, and you should embrace that help.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Chris Oliver, for your work at Tulane University's environmental, I didn't say that right, at Tulane University's environmental law clinic.
I'm not an environmental law clinic. I'm in environmental studies, but I work with them for sure. And we want to make sure that's clear. I'm not a lawyer, but I'm in environmental studies, but we do work with them quite often. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you for correcting me on that.
Sure. Sure.
Thank you again, Professor Chris Oliver, for joining me. And I hope all of you enjoyed this episode. Make sure to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on all of your favorite platforms. And remember, no matter who you are, you can beat the big guys. Okay, so hold on. I'm just going to stop recording.